Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to today's podcast. We are continuing with episode 2 of the Boys to Men series, and I'm super excited to be talking with you again about the Boys to Men series because all of us have men in our lives. We may have boys, whether it be, our own children, whether we are aunts and uncles, siblings, whether we're mentors or in our work environment, somewhere in the family that we're connected to. It could be a neighbor, it could be in your community, your church community. It could be, whether you're a teacher, it could be in the classroom, and in a variety of ways, we all are, there's a certain degree of separation between us and men. And so this series is really sort of looking at and highlighting special circumstances with men and showing them love, right? And showing them understanding and showing some kindness and compassion and wanting to connect more with men. And so I want to spend some time today talking about how the father wound shows up in men, and basically what the father wound is it is a wound that we have where our father or father figures are missing or absent or unable to connect with us. And women can have a father wound and men can have a father wound, and I want to spend some time to talk a lot about the father wound. And I think the father wound is so very important, and for a long time the father wound went unaddressed, or there was especially in psychology, it was a long time before it went addressed, or that it was really critically looked at. And for a long time, the mental health field thought that the power of attachment was through the caregiver, which is typically the mother. But there's a lot that shows that the fathers and how our fathers show up or don't show up in our lives have a significant impact for both women and for men. And I think, fathers, they teach us how to be confident. And of course, I'm speaking in traditional terms, and I recognize that families look different now, and, people are taking on different roles now. But, I'm speaking from what I know, and just from when we look at the traditional family and what the traditional family roles are, fathers teach us confidence, and they teach us how to build, provide, and protect. And so when a father is missing, and so much more, I don't want to I don't want to say that they're just limited to those things, but at the core, those are very strong values and lessons that fathers teach us how to do for both women and for men. The confidence, building, providing, and protecting, and as well as connecting, right? When a man has a father wound, or when a boy has a father wound, the father wound can show up in a number of different ways. Let's start by saying, like, what qualifies as a father wound, or how the father wound initially appears. It appears in boys when your father could be avoidant. Your father could be emotionally or physically absent, meaning that they're not available to you. They're not available to talk to you. They're not available to mentor you. They're not available to validate or connect with you emotionally, physically, on any level. Your father could be narcissistic or abusive. And how that could show up, they could be physically abusive, they could be emotionally abusive, meaning they could be hypercritical or insensitive to what your needs are. They could be toxic to your masculinity or to your boyhood, meaning that they are, everything is like, they may criticize your mother for nurturing you, saying that you don't need to be nurtured, you don't need to be cared for, or you need to man up all the time, and you need to be strong, and you need to not cry or not express any emotion. So toxic masculinity can show up in that way. They could be hypercritical. Everything that you do or nothing that you do is ever good enough, right? Or they feel like they can do it better than you, or that your struggles aren't really struggles, or you don't really know what struggles are, because back in their day, this is what was defined as a true struggle. And so, you're just kind of whining, or you're not being man enough, right? And you don't know what true struggles are. They can discipline, hyper focus on discipline, so they can rule the home and you with an iron fist. Discipline is over the top corporal punishment, or physically crosses the line between physically abusive, or maybe they don't talk to you about discipline, and then they're just hyper focused on discipline and making a man out of you, or making an example out of you through over the top discipline. And along the lines of hyper focus on discipline is that they can also be hyper focused on spirituality. And so they rule the house with an iron fist through the eyes of God, right? And doing everything. There's, the when I say that they're hyper focused on spirituality, it's nothing is ever good enough. Nothing that you do is ever good enough through God's eyes, or you're not being Christian enough, or you're not following the Bible, or the Bible is harsh. Again, never provides you with approval. So if you grow up in a Christian home, or harsh religious home environment, where again, nothing that you never get approval from the church, you never get approval from God, or God is the reason why you must be disciplined or spoken to harshly because you're not lovable enough. If your father is an alcoholic or addicted to other substances, right? And that, that could be gambling, that can also be pornography in addition to drugs and alcohol. Your father's your father's first love is their addiction, and everything else is comes thereafter that. If your father is abusive to your mother or the other parent in your household, right? They send you messages that, that they can't connect with the other parental figure. If your father is a womanizer or a ladies' man, or is constantly chasing after sexual gratification or gratification through other people, that could also show you that not only are they emotionally unavailable, but they seek validation through through those methods, right? And again, your father can be absent in a variety of other ways too. So your father could have passed away at an early age or any age, really. Your father could be incarcerated. Your father could be in the military and is just not present in your life. So, again, that wounding can show up through absenteeism. That wounding can show up through abusiveness. That wounding can show up through, unhealthy interactions with other people. And, one other way that the father wound could show up that I don't think is talked about often enough, but I think is very significant, is if your father has a severe mental illness, especially if they have a mental illness whereas their symptoms are not controlled, or they are not taking their medication or going to their mental health providers. So that's another way that the father wound can show up. And there could be other ways as well. But those are the ways, those are the most common ways that father wounds show up, and or how that looks in your life, or that could be that those are the ways in which those could be indicators that father wounds are showing up for you. Okay, so how does this manifest throughout your boyhood, throughout your teenage years, and in your relationships, and through your adulthood, in your adult relationships? How does this manifest? There's a myriad of ways in which this manifests. One of the first ways, which is prevalent, which I don't think a lot of people pay attention to, or maybe they're not aware of. I won't say pay attention to, but they may not be aware of, is I think the first way, and this came up a lot for me when I would work with men who were incarcerated, is that when you are a man who is afraid of other men, so if you are afraid of other men, you don't want to be in the same room with other men, you don't have a desire to connect with other men because you're fearful of that power dynamic, or you don't want to open up emotionally, or you feel that men are predatory, or that men can't be trusted, that is a sign that the father wound is present, right? Because you may have received messages that men can be abusive. You, through the harsh and heavy discipline, you could be fearful of your father, right? So therefore you could be fearful of other men, or fearful of what they could do. If you have been sexually abused, right, your father may have been your abuser, or your father may have failed to protect you from that. You could have internalized early messages that the penis is a weapon, right? And so that could be something that you're fearful of. You don't want to be in the room with other men who could potentially have, who could potentially take advantage of you or harm you with their penises, or their brutality of their penis, or, just through other abusive methods in that way. And so that could be the first way that shows up. You might feel like you can't connect with other men, you can't bond or show affection to other men. Again, if you have a father that parented through toxic masculinity, toxic masculine methods, you might have internalized the message, or you might have been taught that bonding with, or connecting with, or crying in front of other men, or showing or expressing feelings and emotions to other men might be gay, or it might be sissy, or it's just something that we don't do, right? Or your father might have taught you, you might have learned through your father that your father doesn't really have friends, so your father doesn't really know how to talk to other men. The second way that the father wound can show up is through men, boys, men, teenage boys having insecurity or a lack of confidence. And this can manifest in a number of ways through having low self-esteem, having a very fragile ego, um, feeling a very sense of low self-worth. And when you talk about people that can have very low confidence or very low self-esteem, other pathology can come from that. It's not always going to be the case, but other pathology can certainly come from that, such as, and this is where we start to get into areas of like self-sabotage, in work-life balance, accomplishing your own sort of goals, personal goals that you have for yourself, sabotaging yourself in other relationships. So that's where self-sabotaging behavior can come from. Again, because if you never had that relationship with your father, that confidence, that validation was never, provided to you in terms of accomplishing your goals. And also, too, if you have a missing or absent parent, specifically if the parent maybe left, maybe it was through divorce, or the parent left and got a new family, or the parent was just never there to begin with, internalization of messages like I'm not lovable, or if the person that's supposed to be in my life doesn't love me, or isn't here for me, or doesn't show up for me, then perhaps I'm not worthy. And so that's where you could start to see that those are areas of where you can see the father wound in terms of insecurity, and also people who other areas of deep insecurity can manifest, or fragile ego, or lack of self-worth can also show up in disorders such as narcissism or antisocial personality disorder. And so, with people who have both of those disorders, it stems from a deeply wounded ego. And I want to make the distinction. I'm not saying that if you have a lack of self-confidence, or you have low self-esteem, or a lack of a self-ego, that you're automatically going to develop those things, but you're at a much higher predisposition for developing self-sabotage, and the disorders that I mentioned, as opposed to someone who doesn't have those issues. The third way that this can manifest is inability to know how to connect with women, especially in a healthy way, in a way that's non-sexual, non-misogynistic, and although a lot of issues that men may have with women come from their mother wound, which I'll touch on that next week, there's also implications of this in the father wound, right? Because our father is our first male role model, and we learn a lot of life lessons with how our father sort of navigates the world, and how our father navigates relationships. And one of the relationships can be with our mother, or with our or another other female figures, like with your father and their mother, right? And or just women in general. How does your father navigate relationships with women in general? Does your father respect women? Does your father have friendships with women? Is your father supportive of other women? Is your father protective of other women, including if you may have a sister or something like that? Just looking at how your father may, validate and look at, people like your sister, in addition to your mother roles, your mother. So just looking at how your father navigates, and if your father doesn't have much appreciation, doesn't have much respect, or is abusive or uses um, women, and that behavior is modeled in front of you, that could certainly be something that you pick up on and you learn very early on that this is, these are the messages that you receive and this is how to navigate life, and that you too have also internalized the message or repeated the behavior that women are not respectable. Very similar to, what I'll go into here is, fourthly, I should say, is like, your ability to also show up as a parent. So, if your father is absent, your father is abusive, or your father doesn't, make any attempt to connect with you, or any of the other wounds that I mentioned, there's also a higher likelihood that you are going to repeat what you were exposed to, in terms of you becoming a father yourself, right? So if your father was never there, never available, you're at a much higher predisposition to repeat that cyclical behavior, and which is called intergenerational. That's intergenerational behavior, where, behaviors are passed down, despite whether or not you logically up here say, I don't want to be anything like my father. I promised myself I'm going to show up. I'm going to be the exact opposite of the type of parent that he was. So logically, even if you know this, we can be at a much stronger predisposition to repeat what we saw, or elements of what we saw in the lack thereof of parenting. And, because we can internalize messages that, my father wasn't there for me, so therefore I don't know how to show up, despite whether or not I really want to. I just don't know how to do it. I could be afraid, or feeling like I'm not going to be a good father to my own children. I could feel like this is just something I don't know how to do. I don't know how to be married. I don't know how to be a father. I don't know how to be a parent. I don't know how to be responsible for another human being. So there could be that fear, or that confusion, or that um, that goes beyond the fear and the confusion, but the willingness to just give up and say, you know what, forget it, I don't want to do it. And so this is what I know, as opposed to, having the strength to stay and do something which you don't know, or that you were never taught, or just being fearful of having responsibilities, or taking care of, or being responsible for someone else, or being a husband can also be one of those ways, and where you're very fearful of showing up if you were never shown how to do that. So the father wound can show up there also. Fifth, what I'll say is inconsistency in relationships, which kind of goes into the last one, but this goes beyond that, in that this is where patterns like people who ghost, right? You may be in a relationship with someone and they decide that they're just going to ghost you, or they can't talk about problems, or they can't. You may be the type of partner who just can't show up. You may be also chronically emotionally absent, or unable to commit to a long-term relationship. So you may be fearful of emotions such as intimacy and vulnerability in the relationship. And as soon as the person that you're with, or that you're seeing, starts to show signs of, emotional intimacy or vulnerability, and wants you to kind of show up in the same way to reciprocate what they're showing you, you may be like, mm-mm, I'm out of there. So if you struggle with ghosting, being chronically absent, or unable to commit, these could also be signs that you are struggling with a father wound. And again, if you had a father that wasn't there, or if you had a father that just never kind of came through for you, or was never there when you really needed them to, or kind of was a fair weather father, was a father that's kind of in and out. They just showed up sporadically, or your father that maybe promised you, that they were going to show up for you and they never did. You might be unable to commit. And on the other end of the spectrum, you may be the opposite. You may be also be on the opposite end of the spectrum. You may be the type of person, in addition to being unable to commit, you might be the type of person that digs your heels in. You dig them in really deep in the sand, and you commit to the point where you shouldn't. So when relationships are bad, you're like, I'm gonna stay this out. I'm gonna stay for the long haul. I'm gonna stay through the struggle and the strife. And perhaps this is a relationship that's not good for you, that is toxic, that is unhealthy. You dig your heels in and say, no, I don't want to quit. I'm not going to quit on this person. Despite there being, you might be in a hopeless situation, or you might be in a situation that's actually contributing to your detriment. You might be the person that's hyper committed because you know what it's like when someone has left you. And so you're going to stick it out even when it's not in your best interest to do so. So either end of the spectrum there. And also too, you may be overly emotionally available, right? You might be available to the point where people just take from you and they use you, or you might be giving up too much of yourself in a relationship. So that also shows up here. Again, 6, I think, is where I'm at. You can also struggle with being abusive or angry, or even rage. Sometimes, so people who struggle with anger can serve many different functions, and it can be constructive or destructive. And a lot of times anger serves as a protector, because you may know how to do angry. If someone wasn't there for you, if your father, who's a protector, isn't there for you, right? You have to learn how to fend for yourself at an early age. And you may have other inconsistent people in your life. You may have had to deal with trials and tribulations of, being raised by a single parent or a parent. You may have been a latchkey kid because you were home all by yourself, because the parent who was available had to work to support you guys. And so abuse doesn't come from that, but anger might be an emotion that comes from that. But anyhow, abuse it may come from the fact that, you could be shown an abusive father, or you could have been exposed to an abusive father. You could have been exposed to people that took advantage of you. And so you may have become angry and internalized the message that I'm not going to be taken advantage of again. I'm not going to be manipulated again. And now I'm angry about it. And so I'm going to get you, or I'm going to be more abusive to other people before you get a chance to get me, type of thing. And so with anger again serves as a protector. And instead of being sad, or instead of being depressed, or, instead of being vulnerable and showing other feelings, you could, it might be easier for you to show anger. And so when you become frustrated, or when you become confused, or you're at a loss, as opposed to showing other emotions such as confusion or frustration, you may skip over those and jump straight to anger, because that is a protective mode for you. And that's going to, again, that's an easier emotion for you to grapple with, even though it may be more hurtful or destructive in the long run. Anger or aggressiveness might be the ways in which you know how to show up for yourself, how to stand up for yourself, and how to protect yourself. And you may decide very early on that you don't want to be defenseless, or taken advantage of. On the other end, and then also too, if you had a father that again ruled with an iron fist, and fathers who typically ruled with an iron fist or are hyper focused on abuse or even hyper spirituality, they can oftentimes struggle with feeling inferior or feeling anxious or depressed. And so abusiveness is a way to sort of control the environment, control everybody else in the environment, and get the upper hand. And so, again, that could be a behavior that's passed down to you. Nine, if you could feel devoid of emotion. So again, we look to our father, again, just like we look to our mothers for validation, for emotional attunement, right? And if we don't have anyone there to help attune us or validate how we feel, right? If we don't have that father figure there, we could be very devoid of emotion. We could show up as a person that is difficult or impossible to talk to in relationships. Like, it may be hard for your partner to talk to you about how they're feeling. It could be hard for them to even gauge how you're feeling because you are emotionless, or you don't really allow your emotions to be expressed, or you may only have a small range of emotions that you allow yourself to express. And so if you are devoid of emotions, or, you refuse to talk about emotions, or, talk about emotions or problems that come up in a relationship, that can be difficult for you and your partner to be on the same page, because we look to our partners for validations of our experiences. We look to our partners to help us feel emotionally safe. And if you may be at a point where you don't feel emotionally safe in showing up, but you also in you not being able to be emotionally safe or expressive, that also carries over to your relationship with your partner, where where you guys don't feel emotionally safe with each other. Lastly, again, feelings of anxiety and depression. Again, depression, if we don't have someone there, depression can manifest. It could be internalized anger. We may be angry with ourselves for our parents not showing up or not being there. We could internalize blame for ourselves or our parents not being there, especially if it was something like a high conflict divorce, or or something where a parent may have left the family and maybe started where your father may have left the family and maybe started a new family or something to that effect. We can internalize blame. Or if our father may have passed or was incarcerated, or maybe we moved away from our father or something to that effect, we could certainly internalize those feelings of anger, and that can manifest itself as depression, is not having someone there. And that depression could be triggered throughout your life when you see other people like getting married, right? And fathers walking their daughters down the aisle, or fathers showing up for their sons at their basketball games, or, fathers that come and visit their children in college, or, you know, just different ways, birthdays, holidays, those things, those feelings can be triggered by the absence of that parent during certain times of life, certain hallmark moments, maybe even your graduation, or maybe even a special time in your life. You may wish for your father to be available when they are not. And so that's how that wound can show up there. And so I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about, you know, What can we do when the father wound shows up? If we have a father wound, how can we heal from a father wound? First thing I will say is just having that awareness, awareness that your father's, the lack of your father's presence or the way that your father did or didn't show up for you was hurtful and harmful to you in a number of ways. And so, the first step is always, always, always just having that awareness and that insight that it had an impact on you. There are a lot of people who are very dismissive that, my father wasn't there and I'm fine, right? And or refuse to acknowledge that. So I think just being aware and being able to acknowledge how that's impacted you. Number two is that, it's very important to grieve the loss. And grief can show up in a number of different ways. Grief can be, allowing yourself to feel angry that your father didn't show up, allowing yourself to feel sad, allowing yourself to, cry, allowing yourself to really think about or why your father didn't show up or why your father showed up in the way that he did and sort of processing those emotions. I think it's great. And, I highly, highly recommend you processing your father wounds through therapy. Again, having an objective person who could kind of help you process your emotions and show you how to do that in an objective and nurturing manner. Thirdly, accept your father for who or what they are or what they weren't. A lot of times when we have a father wound or when we have a father that was not available, we can get very caught up on being hopeful or wishful that one day our father will show up, or one day they will have an epiphany, and come back into your life. So accepting them for who they are, and recognizing that this is who they are, this is how they show up, and it has nothing to do with you. And so, you have to accept the limitations for, or what was going on for what they were, and just take it at face value. Fourth, you want to be intentional about addressing your father wounds, addressing how it shows up, and doing the work to heal from your father wound. It's not enough to just say that I have a father wound and I know this, and my father wasn't there, and blah 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 blah. And I know that I have some shortfalls, but it is what it is. You have to be intentional about doing the work. This is how we get caught up on cycles where, those intergenerational cycles that I was talking about where people logically know that their father was absent and that they have this desire to not show up like that. But then when there's a misstep in the follow through. The misstep in the follow through is not being intentional about doing the work and making sure that the cycle stops with you, and that this isn't a repeated pattern, a pattern that you repeat with your own children or the other boys that you may have in your life that you sort of interact with, you may mentor for or show up for, or just in your own relationships in general. You have to be intentional about doing the work, whether reading the books, listening to podcasts. You have to be intentional about going to therapy and saying, no, this is going to stop. These are what my challenges are. You have to stick your elbows in the grease and really do the work. There is no workaround around that. And so just being intentional about doing that. You don't want to shortchange yourself there. And then, fifthly or lastly, what I'll say is certainly making sure that you are, how can I put this? We need affirmations, but we need confirmations and validations to go with our affirmations. And what that means is you want to be, when people think of affirmations, they think of like, a bunch of nice words written on a note card. No, what you do need to do is look for confirmations of positive things, positive male role models, men that do show up, men that you aspire to be like, men that you can connect with. You want to start to train your brain to look for new messages, healthy messages about men. And so you want to start to train your brain to look for healthy men in your environment that can build, provide, protect, and show up with you, and that can form a brotherhood with you, that can form a mentorship with you, that can be a peer to you, that both of you have a mutual respect for each other. And so you want to be mindful that, if you lack that or you're limited in that, you want to be mindful and go out and look for that, so that you can also show up and be that in your own life. And so just a little note there about that. Well, I hope that this has been helpful for you, and I hope that you're enjoying this series. If you have a man in your life that can benefit from this, or that that needs this, be sure to share this podcast with them. And I look forward to chatting with you guys next week about the mother wound. And then we have a couple of more episodes in this series, which I'm really excited about. And so I look forward to talking with you more about that next week. And I appreciate you guys being here. And until next time, you guys take care of yourselves and be well.